when Franklin was asked, "What did you create, Mr. Franklin?" He said, "A republic if you can keep it." So here we are.
And the rest of that sentence, which tends to get chopped off, was otherwise we will degenerate to monarchy as every other experiment in government has failed.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Heroes Path Dispatch. I'm Colonel John Fenzel, and I hope you had a good Independence Day. Yesterday, this country turned 250 years old, and we'll talk about how that was marked because it wasn't quite the celebration anyone planned, but mostly today, I'd like to do something a little bit different. We're going to spend the back half of this dispatch on a story that almost no one is telling about the man who is, in effect, running the largest and most expensive War Department in American history. You've probably never heard his name. He's not a general. He's not a household politician. He's a billionaire financier. And the budget he manages this year is about to collide head on with a number that should stop all of us cold. For the first time, the United States now spends more just paying interest on its debt than it spends on its entire military. So that's the thread for today: power, money, and the bill that's finally coming due. First, though, the week. And to walk all of us through it is the man who keeps us honest, Jeff Steinberg. Jeff, welcome back.
Thanks a lot, John. Great to be back.
It's the funny thing is that I was just down your way for the 4th in West Palm Beach, and it was cooler there than it was up here in Maryland. Talk a little bit about the ramifications of the weather. Let's start off with the job report. I think that's probably a good place because it landed on Thursday, and it wasn't good, was it?
No, the number of new jobs created was 57,000. It was way below the projections, which were well over 100,000, according to most of the economists who were looked to for that data. But of course, because the overall size of the labor force is shrinking, more people being expelled from the country on the immigration crackdown, there's no change in the actual unemployment rate. It stayed at around 4.2, 4.3%.
But the participation level is what's lowering, right?
Right. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that even with the, however, exact number in the millions of people basically either kicked out of the country or denied entry and not being part of the labor force, one of the key statistics I look at is what is the percentage of the working age population that is either in the labor force or actively looking for a job. Mm-hmm. And that figure is 63%. So in other words, 37 of the working age population, and this does not include people in a hospital for long-term medical issues. It does not include anybody in state or federal or local prisons. This is people between the ages of 16 and 65 who are qualified for jobs, whether they have the skills or not. Now, a certain percent of those people are working in the underground economy, meaning that they're involved in borderline or actual criminal activity, or they're just hustling without declaring any jobs or income. But that's an extremely low figure, and it's gone down about 5% pretty persistently over the last few decades.
Well, we're at the lowest level that we've been since 2021. And what was happening in 2021? The pandemic.
Right. Exactly.
So it's really dramatic. And I really think that, so the headline looks a lot calmer than the reality. And the reality is that this labor market is losing steam, and it matters for everything that we're about ready to talk about here for this dispatch. And that's that a slowing economy means less tax revenue, which means bigger deficits, which means more debt. And so it's this kind of vicious cycle and that's why it matters to all of us.
Absolutely. President Trump is talking about how he was right that the oil price would go down once the Straits of Hormuz were open. I know we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes, but price of gasoline at the pump is still over $1 higher than it was just before February 28th and the start of the war.
Yeah, I just filled up today, and we have a truck, so it's always going to cost more. But $4.50 a gallon. It cost us $80 to fill up today. It was crazy.
Yeah,
crazy. Well, so let's talk about Iran. If the Iran ceasefire, if we can, Jeff. We've been tracking that. Where does it stand a week into July?
Well, this week is the funeral for the supreme leader who was assassinated on the first day of the joint Israel-U.S. strikes on Iran. And so President Trump basically said that there'll be no activity, there'll be no deployment of Vice President Vance or Witkoff and Kushner or any of the other people for negotiations until this funeral period is over. I think it's important to note that well over 120 countries sent representatives to attend various of the memorial and funeral events. The Russians sent former President Medvedev, who is the vice chairman of the Russian National Security Council. And obviously, many countries from the global south throughout the Arab world had significant representation. The U.S. did not officially attend, and there's at least news reports that Secretary of State Rubio ordered the State Department through the embassies to pressure countries not to attend and participate. So I think that gives you a kind of a feel for the fragility of this ceasefire. Vice President Vance gave an interview a few days ago in which he basically said, we don't know how this is going to ultimately play out, but right now we're happy that the straits are partially open, so countries are replenishing their strategic oil reserves. So some people in Iran are taking that implicitly as an indication this is a pause and not an intended end and guarantee that there'll be no future U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran.
So it's not war, it's not peace. And you said, I think, probably the best descriptor, fragile. It's this fragile in between that could tip either way. And it's still probably the single biggest wild card that's hanging over gas prices this summer.
And I think it's important to just take note that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu placed a phone call to President Trump requesting an urgent visit to Washington.
Yeah. Why don't you tell everybody your assessment on what that phone call or what that visit's going to be about?
Well, Netanyahu is desperate because there's mandatory Israeli elections by no later than October 27th. All of the polls indicate he will lose that election. And of course, he is on a temporarily postponed criminal trial on 4 separate criminal indictments based on fraud and corruption. And I'm sure that he's going to be looking for Trump to provide some kind of Hail Mary pass to save his prime ministership. And I'm sure part of that is going to be seeking to get permission to escalate in Lebanon or even to conduct a new target strike against Iran. The Israeli IDF has been given orders to begin preparing for unilateral Israeli strikes against Iran. And so this is something that is not on President Trump's plate or agenda. And so this is going to be a rather frictional meeting if and when it happens.
So a desperate man meeting another desperate man. That was how you characterized it.
That's exactly right. They're desperate over slightly different things. And in fact, those two desperations are contradictory to one another.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jeff, let's shift here now back home. It's the 250th. We're in the Independence weekend. It's a birthday that happened under storm clouds. What's your assessment?
Well, God was not happy with the way that Trump has basically tried to fuse together the country's 200th anniversary with his 80th birthday party.
Yeah.
And so I think that, but there's a number of other things that are going on. There's a lot of very well-informed activity commemorating the 250th anniversary. There's some very good documentary stuff, everything from PBS to the History Channel to Netflix, having a whole special biographical series on Washington. And of course, we've got the World Cup soccer audiences touring all over the United States and finding that the image that they got from their media back home of the United States in a complete state of chaos, political turmoil, Civil War 2.0 doesn't match with the reality. They're finding kind Americans welcoming them in stores. Walmart is having a renaissance because people are coming into the country and saying, my God, we don't have anything like this back home.
Well, that's positive. I think Peggy Noonan just a week or two ago wrote an op-ed about exactly that, which was It's encouraging. We still haven't lost our soul,
Right.
and people from abroad are realizing that. But boy, oh boy, the weather up here in the Mid-Atlantic was crazy. Just a brutal heat warning, and then storms rolling through Washington disrupted all the celebrations and pushed
Yep.
the president's address on the National Mall to nearly 11
After
o'clock at night.
midnight. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
when he did speak, he called America a nation of winners and promised a golden age. He talked of returning to the moon and reaching Mars. He was sharply attacking communism. But it's a notably political speech for a day that's been traditionally been used as a unifying one. And so the fireworks finally did go off over the mall. But 250 years, it was marked in the heat and the rain and the argument, which honestly is a pretty fair picture of where the country is today, isn't it?
At least where Washington is.
Oh, yeah. Well, Jeff, you and I are old enough to remember the bicentennial. Remember that?
Absolutely.
And it was what a wonderful event. And this was almost the polar opposite of that. I remember I was 13 years old at the time, something like that. And I remember my mom taking us to, remember the Freedom Train that was going all around the country? It had Lincoln's top hat and it had Wilt Chamberlain's shoes, which were like size 23 or something like that. And it was just, it was an amazing, tangible event. You had mentioned all the documentaries. So that's where kind of everybody's celebrating is pretty much online, on TV, but not in person. And that was demonstrated in spades on the mall. I mean, the attendance was very sparse.
Exactly right. I think that's again an indication. I think the basic message to take away from our 250th anniversary is that we are still an experimental republic. And that experiment continues. And that includes the ability to come up with some really bad ideas and have the wisdom and the honesty to correct them. Winston Churchill famously said, you have to hand it to the Americans. They always seem to get it right, but only after everything else has failed. So I think we're going to.
That sounds very Churchillian.
Exactly.
The other thing too is I'd encourage everybody to go back and listen to the webinar that we did with you on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And one of the quotes that always stands out after the Constitution was signed, and I don't know, it's up for grabs on whether or not it was actually said, but when Franklin was asked, "What did you create, Mr. Franklin?" he said, "A republic if you can keep it." So here we are.
And the rest of that sentence, which tends to get chopped off, was otherwise we will degenerate to monarchy as every other experiment in government has failed.
Wow. Jeff, so let's get into the main story because the country's finances are the argument nobody wants to talk about out loud. The most powerful man that you'd never heard of. So let me just set this up. If I ask most Americans who runs the Pentagon, they'd name Secretary Hegseth. Fair enough, but the person who actually is running that building day to day, the chief operating officer of what is now officially called the Department of War, is a man named Steven Feinberg, Deputy Secretary of War, and I'd wager fewer than 1 in 100 of our listeners could tell you a single thing about him. So tell us, who is he?
Comes out of the private equity vulture fund community. His fund that he founded, I think around 2009, called Cerberus Capital, was one of those funds that very much earned the reputation as vulture funds, looking for distressed companies, take them over, asset strip them, leave the carcasses behind, involved in the bailout of Chrysler and a number of other things. They have a whole section that's involved in various defense sector companies. And so he comes out of that part of the financial community, the least regulated and the one most prone to both risk and to really ravenous profit taking. He, as you say, is the Deputy Secretary of War. He's assembled a very large team of former top executives from Cerberus. He's also brought on board about 30 executives from the major Wall Street banks, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and they're not only sitting on top of the $1.15 trillion core Pentagon budget, there's an additional $350 billion that's really Feinberg's baby. And that is money that is to be separately appropriated under reconciliation, meaning that money's got to come out of other parts of the discretionary budget. So that spending is budget neutral. And that $300 billion is to go into expansion of our existing defense industrial base. Now, you could clearly make the argument that if we're going to keep doing things like Iran, like Ukraine, and who knows what else, then we've already depleted a great deal of our inventory of Patriot missiles and other vital equipment. The missiles for our air defense systems are depleted. And in some cases, given the current production capability of the country, it's going to take 6 years to replenish what we went through in the first 3 weeks of the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran. And so a lot more of the inventory came from other fronts, from the European front, even from the Asian front. And so we've depleted our existing minimal inventories in the field in critical areas where our forces on front lines. Yeah. So Feinberg basically got $1.5 trillion to manage. And this is an enormous defense buildup. And of course, Europe is going through a kind of a parallel defense buildup, moving towards 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. And I think you've got to step
fair
back.
To say that's the NATO requirement, right? 5%.
It is.
Yeah.
But when you're spending that much money on military buildup, there's a kind of implicit increased likelihood that one of these flare-up conflicts could lead to a bigger war. And of course, things are coming out of other parts of the discretionary budget, Social Security, we talked about a few minutes ago.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk more about that, Jeff. But the other thing, too, that he's involved in, he's chaired the President's Intelligence Advisory Board in the first Trump term. But there's a reason why nobody's heard of him, because he's famously private. He rarely speaks in public, rarely gives interviews. He's spent his life buying, running, and reshaping companies, as you mentioned. He's now doing the same thing in the Department of War. So he's well at home doing this, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think it's important to bear in mind that with that $1.5 trillion, particularly that $1 billion, you're sitting there in the government picking winners and losers.
Oh, yeah. There's no question right now that he's consolidating power in that building. And this spring, he stood up a brand new economic defense unit. He's folding economic and financial leverage directly into military planning. And so the whole Pentagon's portfolio for drones and unmanned systems, which arguably I would say is the future of warfare, was reorganized to report directly to him. So this isn't a ceremonial number two. And to be fair, the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the past has never been ceremonial. He's always the guy who runs things. I remember Wolfowitz under Rumsfeld, who I was talking to almost on a daily basis, especially in the middle of the night whenever there was a crisis. He's the guy that everybody is talking to, and he's the one who's running things. So I think chief operating officer is probably even a better term for what his position is. But this guy, he's an operator, and he's pulling all the levers that matter.
He put his own people in, take that chain of command in terms of the rebuilding of the military industrial infrastructure of the country. Yeah. People who are former Cerberus executives and guys who he worked with over the years at the big Wall Street banks, they're now in the Pentagon. They are the people who are implementing the policies that he's calling the shots on.
Yeah, it's amazing. But let me ask you this. Do you think Congress is going to grant this? Because if he does, it's going to be the largest single-year defense budget since the Second World War from a proportional standpoint.
Well, the $115 trillion, that's the core defense budget that's included in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Mm-hmm. That's got to be passed. I mean, that covers every expenditure from the Pentagon, including all of our military personnel, all of the base maintenance, all of the equipment and everything. And that piece of it will undoubtedly pass. Some people in Congress are raising concerns about where that $350 billion on top of the $1.15 trillion is going to come from, because it has to come out of some other part of the budget, because basically Speaker Johnson is running it as a reconciliation bill, meaning that they can bypass the filibuster process in the Senate. It's not going to require 60 Senate votes if it's a reconciliation bill and it's offset by cuts elsewhere. So it's budget neutral. And so I think there's going to be more of a fight over that 350 billion. And then on top of that, Hegseth has asked for an additional 88 billion to cover things like the operating costs of the Iran war. Those are expenses already incurred that largely go towards replenishing the stockpiles that we've basically burned through.
So this is more than $1.5 trillion, isn't it?
Correct.
Well, so remember that number, because in a second, we're going to put you into another number right next to it. And that number is the debt, So Jeff, put the other number next to it. The United States is now spending roughly $1 trillion every month just on interest on the national debt. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's now just about to cross the $39 trillion threshold. And of course, President Trump has been jawboning since the day he came back into office, demanding lower interest rates. But the inflation triggered by the Iran war has even prompted the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was put in there as a strong advocate of reduced interest rates, in the position of having to say, we can't do it now because of inflation. So what it means is that the interest payments on the debt are going to continue to be at a higher level, and there's no light at the end of that tunnel. Treasury Secretary Bessent is covering a lot of that debt in very short-term, under 12-month new Treasury issuances. And so it means that those debts are going to be rolling over a lot faster and piling on further interest payments. So the projection is that by the end of this year, we'll be over $2 trillion a year. And that's just the federal government. Let's be clear, that has nothing to do with corporate debt. And of course, there's a lot of trepidation in the corporate bond sector as well. Things like the massive investments in artificial intelligence companies that have not yet produced a single product or produced a single year where they've actually made money. And so there's a lot of areas of significant concern centered around the stability and the viability of the dollar. And more foreign investors, central banks and others that were the mainstays of maintaining the continuing flow of purchases of U.S. treasuries are shifting over to gold or shifting over to euros or even to some degree Chinese yuan. And so if there's fewer people buying those treasuries, then the yields on those treasuries are going to have to be higher, which again starts compounding the speed at which the debt is increasing.
Well, so Jeff, you're getting into something here. It's the part I really want our listeners to hold on to. So forget Washington for a second. What is a $39 trillion debt and trillions a year in interest? Everything that you just mentioned actually mean to the person who's listening right now at their kitchen table?
Number one, aftermath of the war, as we've said, inflation has spiked again in a significant way, and there's downstream inflation costs that we're going to be seeing in the second half of this year because the lack of fertilizer supplies during the 40 days of the war meant that farmers in many parts of the world were not able to fully produce the kind of crop standards and levels that were expected. So we can expect food inflation. If that $300 billion is going to come out of other parts of the discretionary budget, it's going to mean that programs that are part of the general social safety net are going to be reduced. And of course, there's now widespread talk that there's going to have to be changes, meaning future cuts in Social Security because of the inability to maintain the levels of the Social Security Trust Fund. If we have a stable or shrinking labor force today, that's less money going into basically the Social Security Trust Fund. And so we're looking at a situation coming up in the near future. People currently in the workforce are going to be facing cuts in their Social Security benefits when they reach retirement age.
So basically, Social Security now is coming under pressure. And so I want to stop right here and dig into it because that phrase is doing a lot of other work as well. And for a huge share of the people listening, this is the most personal number in the whole show. What does under pressure actually mean and when? It's not someday. It hasn't a date, doesn't it?
It's projected out to 10, 15 years into the future, and people are saying we've got to take action now rather than reach a kind of a break point where the funds are depleted altogether. And so they're talking about various cuts in the benefits rate. It's pegged to inflation. They're talking about disconnecting it from those inflation adjustments. They're talking about extending minimal retirement age within Social Security, a variety of other things.
Well,
And of course,
that big, beautiful bill that you mentioned earlier, that cut taxes that seniors pay on their Social Security benefits. Now, it's popular, but what that doesn't do is lowers the tax bill on their own retirement check. But here's the catch that almost nobody mentions. Those taxes flowed straight back into the trust fund. So you cut them, and you drain that fund faster, don't you?
absolutely right. Plus, the other elements of the big, beautiful bill made permanent the tax cuts on the wealthiest population. They basically reduced the subsidies under Obamacare. And so you've got, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but well over 1 million people no longer enjoying the benefit of just rudimentary health care coverage.
Yeah.
So all of these things, they don't affect every household the same way, but the cumulative effect on the overall ability of the U.S. economy to function is significant, and it's just incrementally getting worse.
Yeah, well, and it all amounts to arithmetic in the end. You can't legislate this out of existence. Social Security works one way. Today's workers pay for tomorrow's retirees to draw out. And in 1960, there were 5 workers paying in for every retiree collecting. Today, it's under 3. 2.9, I think, is the actual number to 1. And by the 2070s, it's headed to about 2 to 1. So fewer workers, more retirees, all living longer than any generation before them. On top of that, the tax that funds the programs only applies to wages up to about $184,000 a year. And because top earners' pay has raced so far ahead, a smaller slice of the nation's total wages gets taxed than back in, say, the 1980s. So put it together, and the program is now about $30 trillion short over the next 75 years. That's a dramatic number. And you can't legislate yourself out of that. And oh, by the way, we're cutting down on immigration. You need immigrants to be able to pay for this generation that's us, you and me, the baby boomer generation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So fewer babies, fewer immigrants means fewer future workers, which means less money coming in. That's the machine.
Right. And this concept of trickle-down economics that was first introduced during the Reagan period is being used on steroids by Trump to justify significant tax cuts for the wealthiest few percent of people. And as you say, the income gap between the top 5% and the bottom 50% has skyrocketed over these recent years as well.
Well, ultimately, there you have it. I mean, this is a promise with an expiration date in about 6 years to decide whether we still mean it or not. And if you're retired or close to it or paying every week and quietly wondering whether it's going to be there for you is a good question. Put that date. I think the date is actually 2032, but with all the pressures that you just mentioned, I think that's moved us a year earlier to having to make a decision.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So it's not necessarily to frighten anybody, but once again, this is just arithmetic, and somehow it's got to get reconciled. But there's going to be a reckoning, no question about it.
Absolutely right.
So, Jeff, let's talk about the 3 things that you see in the week ahead that we're going to be talking about next week.
Number one, President Trump is going to Europe. The NATO Heads of State Summit is this coming week, Wednesday the 8th and Thursday the 9th. And the Europeans are desperately trying to figure out how they can best draw Trump into their belief that war with Russia is inevitable. They're looking at 2030 as a target date. Their Europeans are in their own rush to basically remilitarize. Those who have an institutional memory of the history of the 20th century and 2 world wars that began in Europe should really have some serious reservations about the idea that we are pushing for the Europeans to remilitarize, with Germany absolutely in the lead. Poland is going to the NATO meeting, having sent their top officials to Washington last week, looking to basically have permanent U.S. bases in Poland and for Poland to be brought into the nuclear element within NATO. In other words, nuclear weapons stationed in Poland, moving closer and closer to the Russian border. So all the attention that's focused on Iran and the current Middle East situation, the dangers on the European front are not to be at all underestimated. Secondly, I mentioned earlier that Netanyahu has asked to come to the United States to meet with President Trump on a kind of a desperate, urgent basis. And we'll have to see whether that comes off. He wants to be here waiting for Trump when he returns on the 9th from the NATO summit meeting in Ankara, Turkey. And so I think those two events are critical. The third thing is that when Congress comes back into session, the funding of the Pentagon budget that we've just spoken about is coming up for a vote. And embedded within the NDAA is a complete integration of Israel's defense industrial base into the U.S., basically opening up Israel to direct participation and direct access to many of the defense technologies that the Israelis have not been given access to previously. And there's a pushback against that, but it remains to be seen whether that's going to be sufficient to actually have that either removed or rewritten in some way to give at least some limits and qualifications on that inclusion. So those are the three of the things that I'm going to be particularly looking at.
Great. We look forward to talking to you next week, Jeff. But 50 years ago, this country was born in part out of a fight over money, over debts, taxes, who decides. And it's fitting that this weekend on our 250th birthday, the deepest question facing us again is arithmetic. So the good news is that arithmetic can be faced. It's objective. It just has to be looked at honestly in the daylight. And that's what we're trying to do here. So Jeff Steinberg, thank you as always. It's just great to be with you,
John.
Yep. And to everybody listening, happy birthday to this improbable, enduring country. And thank you for spending part of it with us. This is Colonel John Fenzel. Stay curious, stay engaged, and thank you for walking the path. Take care now.